sort of a copy or like some functionality that is similar to Code Sandbox, to like CodePen, to like those things where you have the code and then you have the window with the preview of the application. Is this what we are talking about?
It'd be more than just JavaScript, though, or more than
no, like those things are not like they're probably more related to JavaScript, but this is how it is supposed to be solved, right?
Yes.
That's what we are talking about now.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Let me listen to the end now.
I wanted to add one thing, which is thanks. By the way, thanks for putting this together, Marcel. I really like the jobs to be done framework. So in this job story, the goal is pretty clear. Like I want to try it out. I want to demo it, and not every project on open source or anything has a demo of the product running, right? They usually have steps to make it run, but they don't have a demo running because that's resource intensive. So I totally get this point. When I read it, I quickly go to what Dennis has been saying, which is the way I usually do it for this job to be done right now is I go in my local machine and I just run it. I just check it out and then I run it. So there is a potential for us to replace that and to make that process better, right? But the jobs to be done, the job story itself is descriptive of something that we already do today, which is great. And it's just a bit painful. So that thing about checking out the code and running all the installation steps for some projects are slim and they're super quick. So they're probably harder to get any advantage on because, I mean, if it takes me 2 minutes to get that set up on my local, then it's hard to get better than that. But for larger projects like Rails and other Python and stuff, I have to set up Postgres or something like that. Then I'm definitely not going to do that for every project I want to try. So depends on the project.
And in this regard, I don't want to dive into deep discussion. I just want to sort of make up my mind and like to realize what this is supposed to look like and behave like. But Andre, you mentioned a really, really important point. Like all the projects are different. There are JavaScript projects, there are Node projects, there are Rails projects. Are we talking about automating the process for all different possible projects, or it's going to be up to a project author to set up all those preview things?
I think it's potentially some of both.
Technically, it's impossible to automate this for all possible projects. Correct. That's what I mean.
Yeah, what Fran has been mentioning on some venues is like you'd have a file so that the author would customize that file. Instead of like just having the README with the steps, he write a YAML with the steps to get that set up in an environment. Right, Fran?
Got it.
But that's jumping to the solution, but yes.
Cool. Yeah.
I mean, it's the same file you can create with VS Code to launch your project. So if you have already configured your VS Code to run your project, you can just copy paste it into your repository.
And if a project needs a Postgres or something like this, we will set this up for the project author. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
I'd like to point something because maybe it's because of my background, but most of the projects I usually try or test are libraries. So, I mean, I don't remember any recent real project I wanted to try. So what do we do in these kind of scenarios in which we are mostly testing Ruby gems or JS libraries?
Can you describe like when you're testing that, what is the outcome? Like what are you trying to achieve?
Technically,
for example,
it's the attempt to try that library for my personal code, right?
Yeah, or at least see it in action. I mean, for example, some recent gem I cloned is about some DB database thing that raises some alerts or some sort of stuff. I mean, in that scenario, maybe the author should provide demo project in which we could add that gem and try it in the web IDE.
What is your typical workflow like when you need to test a gem? Like, what do you do?
That was my question. Yeah.
I usually include it in the GitLab gem file, run bundle, and open a terminal. A Rails console, sorry, to test it, for example.
What is the so when you open the Rails console? Well, I guess let me back up. Do you need to install it into the GitLab project? Is that because you're testing it for something in GitLab, or are you installing it in the GitLab project because there's data and an environment there that has like stuff that you can like use the gem against?
Both. I mean, sometimes it's because our database is quite heavy and I want to try this database stuff, but you can use that in a regular Rails console. You can just require the gem and try it. So you don't really need to add it to the gem file. It's just it's easier if you do it that way.
But like the thing is that there are different types of projects, right? So some projects just don't need to be sort of demoed or tested, like gems, for example. It's very hard to do this, and it's up to the author, to the project author, to decide whether he wants to demo it or not, right? Since the burden of setting this up lies on the package owner or project owner. So he or she might decide just, okay, I don't want this to be demoed, and it's technically like that, and then just showing the README that in order to test this, you need to check this out or clone.
Yeah, but maybe for, I don't know, for Ruby gems, for JS libraries, we can just spin up a very basic Rails or JavaScript project in order to test that library, because we can detect that it is some sort of library, for example. I don't know. I mean,
yeah. So that's what I was asking, right? Is the benefit there, the like, so right, the so I can, or so whatever, right? That last fragment, is that is there a benefit in there for you of I can test a library without impacting XYZ existing environments? Is that like what the benefit would be if you had like a web IDE to do this? Or is that not really a benefit to you?
Not really, but maybe because Ruby gems are quite cheap to install, but maybe Node libraries or JavaScript libraries are heavier because you have to deal with versions, and they can collide with your installed versions and things like that. But
imagine if we were dealing with Python development, we'd probably have a different. We didn't have more experience with wanting something like this, because Python installs modules globally and like even uses like native dependencies and stuff, and those kind of things would love not having to mess up my local environment. Thanks, Andre, for writing for me.
So to summarize it, I think for certain kind of projects, we still have to figure out, would it be helpful? And if so, how can we enable this? While we do see a definite advantage for a couple of other projects or other kind of projects. Is that correct?
yeah, I think that's the point, yeah.
Good.
There's one more thing here in this conversation I think it's useful to highlight is that some of the times the environment on which the project should be tested is specified by the author. Sometimes it's the user who wants to, like for instance, if I have a project that is fully running, then it's easy for me to specify, right, these are the steps to get this running and getting this playable. But if it's a library or a gem or a dependency or whatever, it's up to the user to say what sort of thing, how he wants to test it. You have the end parts on how to integrate it with your app and then how to run it, but how to get it from the bootstrap like level, that's up to the user seeing that project. So that changes from user to user. Just to call it out a little bit, since we talked about the author specifying the README steps and everything. I think that's also one of the takeaways that I get from this conversation. I hadn't thought of the gems scenario, so thanks, friend.
Is there a difference between wanting to utilize the gem or library or package and wanting to contribute to the gem or library or package? Like
absolutely.
The difference in the like environment that you might need for that?
That's the question I put there. I didn't ask it, but the point is like, if we are talking about contributing to the project, then usually, at least I don't do this. I don't check the demo when I want to contribute. Like things like activity of the project, the number of maintainers, these things play much higher priority for me, because apparently if I decided to take a look at this project and maybe contribute to this means that I have already had the experience with this project before getting to it to contribute. That's the main point. This is the scenarios of using the package and contributing to package. These two are completely different things, I think.
For Rails as well, or for Ruby as well, it's completely different.
Can you go a bit into the workflow of what you usually do to contribute to such a project?
I can do. First of all, I'm not new to this project. If I have the wish to contribute and evaluate my sort of ability to contribute to this project, this means that I have already had experience with this project. I don't need it to be demoed to me. I want to see how welcome my contribution might be, means how actively developed this project is, how many maintainers, how often are the releases, so these things, so that my contribution wouldn't sort of be like laying down in some dark corner. So these things are playing much higher role for me. And also like if we talk about popularity of the project, like stars for the project, these things play a huge role for me. But demoing it, I in nearly 99% of the cases, if not 100% of the cases, I'm already familiar with the project when I'm willing to contribute to it.
Got it. So this is more for figuring out whether I want to contribute and in which kind of way, correct?
Yes.
Okay. When we go into how you actually become an active contributor, how do you make contributions? Can you go a bit more into this kind of workflow? How do you actually pick for what you want to work on?
It depends on the it depends on the projects. Some projects, some open source projects that I contributed to, required me, even before I make my first contribution, required me to sign some agreements, even though they were open source. So that's the first step. That has nothing to do with the code, right? But when it comes to the code, I still had to check out the code and look around and play with it, because technically, when it comes to the contribution, I want to try something that is not in the project yet. This is the whole point of contribution. It's not about demoing. Like demoing, okay, I see this project lacks the functionality that I want to contribute, and in order to provide this functionality, I have to check out, like I have to clone the project and play with it locally anyway. And if I'm about to contribute, I have to be more or less skilled enough in order to do things in the terminal and sort of demoing it in the web interface is, I don't know, even if I would come to a project that would have a demo, well, I would probably take a look at the demo, but it wouldn't play any significant role for me whether I want to contribute or not. That's irrelevant to me.
Can you step away from the concept of the demo and into the concept of the tools that you have locally and how you use those, right? So it's more about, I would say this is more about, what are the things that what are the pain points that you have when you try and get that started locally?
I have one failing story, for example, real quick about that with Rails. I mean, in Rails, you can test or run the specs with RSpec or Minitest or other gems. So sometimes I've had problems downloading those related gems, those dependencies. So I couldn't run the specs myself locally. So I commit things, I push them, and I waited for CI to run the specs for me because I couldn't locally. So I rely on CI. It's slower, but it's the use case we will be fixing here because we will provide a custom environment in which you could run your specs, not locally, but mostly.
Because it clashed with your local RSpec, or
exactly, yeah.
Some things that'll happen too is some of those development scripts are like built for, like, maybe all their development team is on Windows or a different OS than what I'm working on. So sometimes, even though, hey, I can technically run this everywhere, the development side is like really just specified towards one environment. And, you know, people take contributions for, hey, how can we cross-platform this? When we look at some of these like whys, when we're answering the why question and some of the problems people run into contributing, I know that GitLab and the GDK is kind of in a special box, but we do have a lot of contributors, and I think we can look at their motivations and kind of glean from, kind of abstract that to other projects. And I see a surprising number of contributions that don't have the GDK set up. And they're kind of just eyeballing it. Or I guess they trust the maintainer to run it locally. And I think that a number of other projects would do that as well. Because there is a difference between setting up a development environment and the application. So one thing that'll happen, and I think a lot of these contributors, they're probably users of GitLab and they see bugs and they want to fix them. And I think that happens, that's probably, I'm just totally coming up with this number in my head, but that's got to be close to 33% of the reasons why people are open source contributing is, I'm using this, but I'm seeing bugs and I want to fix it. And I'm running it locally, so I kind of can tell like what's going on here, but it gives me just enough so that, hey, I don't have to set up the whole dev environment locally. I can kind of blind patch it and then trust that one of the maintainers can actually run it and test if it's good. I think that workflow happens a lot. As we're also talking about this, and as I look at our community contributors, I see, I was having a conversation with another one earlier this week about the GDK is interesting, and yeah, a lot of, I think, contributors feel like it's a pain to set up, but I see a lot of contributors do things where they're just running off of tests. Like they don't necessarily need the whole thing running. They'll just run like controllers that work off of our specs. So they need the whole stack running. Or if I'm doing front end, like they just work off of our front end tests. So I've seen some contributors even just be satisfied with half a development environment where I can just run RSpec or just run unit tests. so if someone's wanting to contribute, they're going to find a way to contribute one way or another. And people that are using the product want to fix bugs. Other people just kind of want to put it on their resume or online portfolio of, hey, I've contributed. And that means a lot to them. And they're kind of willing to do that one way or another. This has been my experience.
So, Paul, what you're saying is that for any given project, you can have different sets of environments depending on the people working on that. Like there's different scopes in any. So one project can have different scopes for testing things, and you contribute.
Oh yeah, we have that. We experienced that internally. We have lots of people. I don't think I have my runner working right now. And then lots of people are doing development locally. Fran is looking at me like, come on, Paul, we set this up together. I don't think I have it working locally, but I know, and as I view other people's MRs, like they have other environments that I'm like, I'm not going to set this up. I'm just going to trust them to run it. So yeah, no, and I want to try to, and I like what Marcel's saying about not getting too coupled to GitLab's world here when we try to solve this problem. But I do think some of our human motivations still apply outside of GitLab. Side note, while I have your guys' attention, while we talk about like containerizing these environments, and I brought up, hey, this is a big deal for like native stuff because native dependencies aren't locally scoped like node modules or Ruby gems. There's a huge caveat to native dependencies, and that's the processor that the dependency was built on. There's whole companies that even though something's containerized, I could still be using a dependency that just doesn't even work on my machine because natively it was compiled under a different processor. So there's whole companies that let you do this, like take a container and then now create 10 containers based on building all these native dependencies across different platforms. So while we look at potential solutions for, hey, we want to have a one-stop shop environment running thing, we need to be aware of the actual machine that this is running. When we look at solving the native problem, the machine that's running and the machine that these libraries are compiled on.
Thanks, Paul. That is all very good information. I know we're like already half an hour in, and I think we've talked about the first kind of contributing area a lot. I don't know if there's anyone else that has like an additional, and thanks Andre for bolding out the jobs to be done. I tried to synthesize that first part of the discussion into C there, so maybe that kind of captures, I think, like the value of that, and maybe it needs to be more explicit to something that's more global. But I think that's what there. I am. I'm super interested in code review because I know all of you do a significant amount of code review and maintainer review. So I'd like to shift to that if we can. I do want to get to security too. I just don't know about time because I am curious, like from a release process, like I don't think I've heard a single developer say they like having to do security patches. And so like, I'm wondering if this is like another opportunity where we could solve some problems there. And so, but code review would be something good to do. And I'd say read these two and then like feedback on what these are solving.
Yeah, maybe I can give a quick intro why I actually added code review. This topic came up when I showed a couple of other designers around what's going to happen with the web IDE. And Pedro, who's in source code, mentioned that one thing that comes up very often in code review is that navigating code on our own homepage is a big pain for them. A couple of people already in different research issues have provided feedback around, if I could see all of this like directly in my local IDE, that would be awesome. That would make things so much easier. And so I saw a potential advantage or improvement if we could actually enable them to switch to the Thea or whatever other web IDE to do this kind of code review and to see these kinds of changes in there. So I know that we have actually a maintainer here who probably does a lot of code review. So maybe, Paul, do you want to give some insight into like how this currently works? What are the pain points for you when reviewing this code, and whether there's any advantage you can see?
Yeah, I'm gonna use this time to argue for my create a patch from the web IDE feature. I'm just joking. So my code review process, and I think if every reviewer is going to be a little different, but my code review process is 95% of the time I check it out locally. I look at the files and the lines that have changed from using the MR diff, but I kind of have to see it in the scope of the whole file and everything else that's going on. So I look at what's changed and I actually see it. What does it look like actually on my computer? I do end up doing a lot of QA. So every line that I see, I run it all locally. I tried to, if the environment is good. And oftentimes when I give feedback, rather than just giving a comment of, hey, change this because this is too many lines, I'll make a suggested change locally. And I'll even make a commit locally, and I'll create patch files and patches off of that and add those as comments. So I want to see what was the review, but I also want to see what are my suggestions on top of it, because I want to try to reduce as much back and forth as possible. I don't want to give a contributor something that's gonna break. So it's a lot of QAing and just running the actual thing we're fixing locally, but also understanding the whole change and the scope of everything is huge. And I use grep all the time for, like, if we've deleted a function, I always check, did we actually remove all of our references to this? And I have to grep on our file all the time. But we don't have this anywhere in GitLab where natively I can just grep on a regex. Are there any references to this in the, well, I guess we have search code, but I'm going to stop there.
No, you have a point. I think it's one of the things that might be behind, and this is probably speculation, but one of the feedback that Marcel just highlighted from the source code is that people usually prefer to just look at the code in their local environment, in their local IDEs. And one of the things is exactly about that. You have native tools at your disposal, and not just that, you have your own wealth of plugins and extensions that you're used to. So you're reviewing the code the way you usually author it, and that's much more comfortable than a generic UI. And you just described one of the features, which is like a regular expression search on the whole code base. That's a feature that you have locally in your tool set, which also happens to be the terminal.
When you say you check out each branch, like each contributor's branch, so you have like one version of the GDK, and then inside the GitLab folder, you're checking out. No, you guys are doing it. Yes, no, Fran. I don't know.
No. I was thinking you were going to say something different. Yes, I use the same GDK directory for code reviews. So the problem I have, for example, with database reviews is that I have to perform migrations locally. My database is going to change. Then I forget to roll back, or I have to go to a different merge request, and my local database is in a different state, a very strange state sometimes, and I have to reset it because I can even update my local environment in master after.
Okay, so one GDK that you do all your reviews, you go to the GitLab directory, change the branch, and then whatever happens based on that code branch is what happens. And then you hope that when you check out the next branch, you haven't destroyed other dependencies inside of that. Okay.
Yeah, basically that, yeah.
And so I think the benefit that we're trying to, like on the code review side, right, like the clear benefit would be like, if you could launch something closer to your local environment with the tools that you need, like, and maybe there's a baseline of like tooling that you need that we're not aware of that would be helpful to understand. But if you could launch like an online version of that runs whatever that branch is and whatever crazy changes are in that without impacting like the next one that you need to do because they're all isolated in their own thing, that would be a clear benefit to that review process, right?
Yeah, for me it would be better to have isolated spaces for different reviews. Also, it's in other one of the other points that sometimes when we upgrade GitLab, it's really difficult to go back to a previous version. For example, for security patches or any other stuff, it's really difficult to go back. So sometimes I have had troubles to roll my local environment to a previous version, and I do the same as developing for open source. So I fix the code, I push it, and I wait for the CI to run the test for me.
So comforting.
And I think with a containerized version of that version, a containerized environment of that version will be really helpful because I won't touch my local environment.
And do you run into that primarily? And I know that's kind of jumping ahead to security, but that is to me, that's like the key thing that we can do with security. Like to me, security is like the easiest use case to describe because basically I can give you a version at whatever, especially like when you talk about dependencies, right? Like if you have dependencies in those old versions that are pinned to older versions, you need those versions of the dependencies, not whatever you've now upgraded to in the latest, right? And I think or if you're fixing security holes in those dependencies, you need them at that version, right, to be able to deal with that. To me, security feels like a very obvious and easy one, assuming we can get environments set up correctly to like deal with those pinned versions.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And other use case is when you have to debug a problem. I mean, we have some sort of issues in which a user say, hey, I have this bug and my version is 10.0. Okay, so it's quite far from our current version. So I have to start debugging. First, I try in the current version, but sometimes I have to go to a previous version in order to start debugging the code in order to see where or how the bug is created.
Yeah, I had a similar problem several times when I had to figure out when the regression has been introduced. And it's really, really not that trivial to get to some, like, it's more or less fine to go one version back, like maybe two, but then like the whole thing just, it was like, that's the reason why I had to rebuild completely the whole GDK a couple of times, because it's just like, it just doesn't work. Then having this sort of containerized and like isolated, that would be really, really nice, really good.
Can I ask you a question? So for those scenarios where we do go back to those previous versions, so say that we would set up a GDK for 11.1 version of GitLab. How often do we get to reuse that? Is that something for one time only? Because someone has to create these versions, right? We either create containerized version of the GDK for each release we do, and then we have an archive of those for the future, or you'd have to set that up yourself every time you need it. And that's kind of like where we are right now. So the value starts when you get to reuse those.
It all depends on how bad the code was in that particular version. So how many developers introduced regressions in that particular version?
Because if there's more regressions, there's more reuse.
Sure. But this is something that we cannot predict, and ideally we should not reuse in this scenario, right? Otherwise we are doing something wrong.
Correct. Yeah, because we cannot see the value of just like, I want to jump to 12.3 version and then click a button and I have an environment there set up. But if it hasn't been set up, I have to do it myself, and it's still the same thing.
Yeah, the problem is that if we have it set up And even if it's used by any developer, even once, this will save these developers so much time, like figuring out how to roll back the versions of GDK and GitLab, then figuring out that your database is completely borked, and then like cleaning up the whole GDK, reinstalling everything. This takes an enormous amount of time, and like having this sort of pre-set up is a real time saver, even if for one developer.
Even for merge requests, if we can create a version, a container of a merge request for code reviews in which there are front-end reviews, back-end reviews, and also database reviews, we could reuse that merge request, that container 3 times at least. Then I think we can remove it once the merge request is merged, for example.
Yeah, they have to keep updated every time there's a push, but yes, I think I can definitely see that. The question is whether that will be a shared environment for all reviewers, or it would be one copy of that canonical environment every time you want to use it. You'd spin up a copy of that container, and you could play around with it without destroying the original canonical container.
Yeah, these containers are kind of big. Like, so I've loaded old Docker containers of GitLab, like when trying to figure out things like when was a bug introduced, or like doing some slightly visible debugging, but they're like almost a gig size, and because they each have very different dependency stacks, they don't really share. Like, containers can share like the stack of other containers, but these ones I've noticed when I've installed 2 versions next to each other, there's not any sharing of it's like a brand new gig you're downloading, at least. So they're kind of big.
Yeah, and that takes time to copy and stuff. Yeah, for sure.
In the non-GitLab world, which is tough to abstract yourself from, but do other places you work, other people that you know that work other places, is the code review and security bug fixes universal to development, or is it because GitLab is such a giant monolithic app with like a GDK that sort of works pretty well, kind of?
I think you also have to keep in mind, like, not a lot of development is product based. Like, a lot of development is services based, and even like one-off services. So there's not really a supporting old versions. There's just always the latest quote unquote working version. So I do think that this problem is definitely going to be unique to product based development. But even then, like, I think GitLab is going to be even a smaller subset. So I don't think this is a very wide problem personally.
I could second that. I've been working in another product development environment, and like the process, the routines were completely different. So it's really hard to find two similar development processes. So this is something, but this means that every project will have their own sort of issues with that or another side of review process. And again, it's hard to serve for everybody.
Is code review likely universal to all projects, or no? Like, the experience of needing to like check out a project and examine it and or check out a branch and do that, or is it because our features are bigger, or is there something specific? Like, what I'm driving at is, like, we talk about this very GitLab centric, which is fine. I just want to make sure that this is a universal pain.
No, it's not. Again, like different projects I've been working with, like all of them had different level of sort of different process for review in terms of like people dedicated to the review, like either same people or different people. In one of the projects, it was CTO who always wanted to review the code, and obviously, since he was CTO, he didn't have enough time, so he was just glancing the code and like whether it makes sense or not. So the processes are completely different in different companies and different projects. That's from my experience.
mature development organizations of like like enterprise engineering organizations maybe, or people doing enterprise software? Is that more close versus like consumer software, right? You can sometimes be like, I'm thinking iOS apps, right? Like I think very rarely like do they have to worry about someone on an old version, because Apple just like updates those in the background and they're like, no, you should just be on the latest, like that's the bug fix. Whereas like in our case, right, it's enterprise software, and like telling customer X to go get on the latest version, they go, no, fix it, right? Like it's a different conversation.
Yeah. I can tell you from that mature process, mature companies doing that. I've only seen one case where they don't do code review, which is a company here in Lisbon, Volkswagen Group, where they're doing extreme like pair programming, pair designing, and pair product managing. So every time someone writes code, they're writing together with someone else. So when they merge it, it's already been reviewed. So in that sense, the code review doesn't exist. But I would say that it's a fair generalization to assume that most mature digital product development companies do code review in one shape or the other. It will change. Sometimes they'll just like do a brief pass. Sometimes they'll do a deeper like we do. But I think that's more general than the security process. That's what I want to talk about, because I think our security process is a little bit more convoluted because we're working on a public repo by default, and then we have to go hide under a rock to do the security issues. But most companies already have private repositories, so they can just like branch off master and just fix the security issues themselves. And then the security issues process is less scrutinized because they're already private. So we have another layer of complexity there, because we have to have another project do that in a private instance, that kind of thing. But most companies, I would say, would have already private repos, and they do just fix them. That's my experience so far. I don't know if anyone else has others to share.
Even if GitLab was a private project, if our process was still to release for 3
correct
regressions,
that's still common.
Then that portion of it still stands, right? The part
correct.
where you need like the back 3 versions doesn't matter. Yeah, like the difference of like the dev.gitlab.org is less important. Sure. In this, it's more. Is that the
backports? The backports usually go to X amount of versions. Yes, usually.
I know we're now nearly up on time. Are there any other areas of like space? So like contributing your product, we talked about code review, and we talked about security a little bit, kind of mix and match the two. Is there any other like area where
so there's when we have here this category of security, one thing I'm really interested in if I was a maintainer or a contributor is my actual security of checking out code that I don't necessarily trust. So security of if this is on my local machine, like I'm really interested in containerizing something that I don't do all the time. For one, of if I'm having to install a bunch of dependencies and they tell me to use these third-party version managers or stuff, like those are all vulnerability vectors, and that's a little concerning. So containerized environments, there's a huge sell on secure containerized environments, 1 as a contributor, and then 2 as a reviewer. I'm surprised I don't do this, and I'm surprised we all don't do this, but man, that's a way to do remote code execution, is to push some malicious code in a merge request and have the reviewer run it. That's a scary thing. Yeah, I guess we recorded this. I don't want to give anyone ideas because this kind of stuff worries me. So, but yeah, when I saw security here, I was really, that's what my mind was going to. And I see, we're talking about our security fixes and stuff, but security of a local environment, I am personally really interested in, for no other reason than I'm just paranoid.
Another scenario could be, for example, training. I mean, if you train somebody or a class into some specific topic, you don't need to set up your local environment. You don't, or for example, I remember at my university we had very old machines, or we had to deal with Windows development, and all our machines were unique space machines, and you need to develop something. You can use this containerized environment to work on a different operating system, for example.
The last
Yeah,
one
the more I just wanted to add one more thing. The more we talk about here, I'm getting this sense that the containerizing of the environment is on every story we tell, right? From the bottom to the top, we've been talking about this thing about isolating the environment, isolating the environment, isolating the environment. I haven't heard so much us arguing for containerizing the UI of the editing of the code. Maybe I know that we're out of time, but but I'm trying to see if there's anything that we haven't been discussing where we can really take advantage of something like this, where the UI of the editing, the IDE, what's the advantage of putting that in the cloud? In which, because we do want to work and change the code in the environment, but we have ways to do that with our local tools connecting to a remote environment. And I wanted to make sure that we discuss this a little bit, or at least think about this a little bit, about what's the advantages there. Why does that support my case of doing all of this if I can just like change it locally and use my tools and don't have to worry about anything, and I can update that on my own. I can use whatever tool I want. Say that I don't like VS Code anymore, I want to go back to Sublime. I can still use that if I can connect to a local environment with my tool. Does anyone has any ideas or thoughts on that particular scenario? Advantages of doing that?
Yeah, for example, debugging.
Right. Go on.
I mean, in order to have debugging out of the box, you have to, imagine a scenario in which you have your container. If you want to debug that, you have to install those tools remotely. But here we will provide everything. Another user story would be to launch a project with VS. I mean, you can do this with, for example, a Makefile, but with VS Code and the way we're thinking it, you will be able to run the project without knowing what are the other related projects or what has to be running in order to run completely the project.
Yeah, the debugging you mentioned is like I'm in the code of the editor and I want to debug the controller in Ruby that it's running in that container from the UI of the editor. Okay,
yeah,
that's a fair scenario. Thanks.
I think Kai put in a link to one very interesting point in code review that I also just saw and just thought about when Paul talked about how you open the branch in, for example, Visual Studio Code. But if I understand correctly, you then have to switch back to the browser. You have to find the correct code. You have to find the correct line to add a comment. I can imagine that this must be a big pain, correct?
It is.
So if we have more control over the UI of the editor, and if we have a direct connection, we might find ways to directly connect these two cases. And I think I just quickly like scanned over the link that you posted, Kai, but I think Gitpod already does this in some kind of way. So I don't see why we shouldn't be able to do that as well.
James Ramsey has had some really interesting ideas of using like push options to do into magical stuff. So there's one thing we could do with like we have complete control of the editor. We could do some really fancy like integrating of lines where I can edit and comment like all in the same line. Like that'd be really crazy. But with push options being like this can be captured by the controller and can parse data and do something interesting there. It's feasible that we could do a whole code. I could do a whole code review locally in line and then push up to that branch with an option, and like it parses that data and applies that review.
You
So
should look at the Gitpod thing.
What'd you say?
You should look at the link that I sent to Gitpod. That's basically, it is all of your comments and code review all in their web UI.
Oh wait, I'll check it out. Cool.
Sure, it would take some work, but I think the web IDE to be able to do all of that would be interesting. Locally as well, I guess supporting that, but I think we could solve this in a browser in a way that's like more unified with our experiences versus how that might have to play in each kind of local environment. I know we're all at time, so
I have to run, but I don't think the conversation is like reached a point of like the end, but let's keep chatting. And Marcel, if we can help in any way, like throwing more thoughts on this, pull us in.
Definitely.
Yeah, thank you all for your feedback and use cases. Very valuable.
Bye, everyone. Sorry for rushing out.